Clash Royale King is back!
Clash Royale, the game that brings out the best in us and the absolute worst.
I'm gay!
Nothing fuels gamer rage quite like running into that deck. You know the one, the kind that makes you question your life choices, your internet connection, and whether Supercell secretly hates you. From brainless spam decks to unbreakable defensive fortresses, these monstrosities have one goal: to make you suffer. So today we're diving into the most annoying decks ever. The ones that ruin our win streaks, destroy our sanity, and somehow still exist despite every balance change. Get ready, because this is about to get rage-inducing. Now, what better way to start off than talking about Hog 2.6? The way these players can defend my 17 Elixir push with a cannon, ice spirit, and skeletons will always be frustrating, at least to me. Hog 2.6 is one of the most iconic decks in Clash Royale history, but where did it come from? While cycle-based Hog decks have been around since the game's early days, this version, featuring Hog Rider, Musketeer, Ice Golem, Skeletons, Ice Spirit, Fireball, Log, and Cannon, really started gaining popularity in 2017. What made it stand out? Its absurdly low 2.6 average elixir cost. Other Hog decks used cards like Mini P.E.K.K.A. or Inferno Tower for defense, but 2.6 took a different approach, leaning entirely on cycle speed, placements, and micro interactions. The goal was simple: outcycle your opponent's counters so they never have the right response ready, defend efficiently with cheap troops like Ice Golem, Cannon, and Musketeer, and chip away with constant Hog pressure while maintaining control of the match. By the time your opponent placed their first defensive building, you were already 2 cards away from another Hog Rider. But why did 2.6 become so iconic? For years, 2.6 was everywhere, from ladder to competitive play. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. One, it was simple to learn and hard to master. On the surface, it's a basic cycle deck, but to play it at a high level, you need insanely precise microplay, perfect defensive placements, and a deep understanding of cycle manipulation. 2, it was the ultimate free-to-play deck, containing only 1 legendary, no epic cards, and no champions. This makes the deck extremely accessible for anyone picking it up. 3, it has survived countless meta shifts. Even after Musketeer, Skeletons, Ice Spirit, Hog Rider, and Ice Golem have received countless nerfs, 2.6 remained viable, proving that a skilled player could always make it work. And finally, 4. It's a true test of skill. Some of the most well-known Clash Royale players built their reputations around 2.6, mastering its mechanics to outplay even hard counters. But despite its legendary status, the debate rages on. Is 2.6 skillful or just spam? Here is where the community is a bit divided. There's one half of the community that uses the "it's skillful" argument, saying things like it requires precise placements for the Ice Golem kiting, cannon positioning, and Musketeer spacing. Micro interactions matter, knowing exactly when to cycle Skeletons, Ice Spirit, or pre-log an enemy response. Outcycling isn't brain dead. Great players track every card in the opponent's cycle to force mistakes. And you have to play perfect defense with no heavy tanks or defensive buildings like Inferno Tower. One mistake can kind of just cost you the game. But on the other side, there are also people using the "it's just spam" argument, saying it's literally just throwing hogs until you win. Outcycling doesn't feel skillful when the deck is designed to cycle faster than everything else. If the opponent doesn't have the right counter in hand, they just get steamrolled, and it's frustrating to defend against. By the time you drop a building, the next hog is already coming. So no matter what, it's annoying to face. At the end of the day, whether you see a 2.6 as a masterpiece of cycle strategy or just a spam fest, one thing is undeniable: playing against it is miserable. Games tend to drag out into overtime, and seeing your push get vaporized will never feel good. A skilled 2.6 player will outplay you with perfect placements and outcycling your key counters. A mediocre 2.6 player will just throw hogs at your tower endlessly until you run out of Elixir. No matter the skill level though, facing this deck feels like a chore. So whether you respect it or hate it, one thing is certain. When you see that Hog Rider deployed at the bridge, you're in for a long, frustrating game. Spawner decks, or hut spam, has been around since the earliest days of Clash Royale, frustrating players for years. The idea was simple. Instead of relying on quick cycle or powerful win conditions, overwhelm the opponent with an endless flood of troops. Some of the most infamous spawner cards include Goblin Hut, Furnace, Barbarian Hut, Tombstone, and Goblin Cage, all spawning their respective troops. A typical spawner deck would stack multiple buildings while supporting them with defensive spells like Poison, Arrows, or Fireball. The strategy? Just let the spawners do the work while you sit back and defend. It wasn't long before players started hating these decks. Unlike traditional win conditions like Hog Rider or Golem, spawner decks didn't need to attack. You just had to survive while your buildings did all the damage for you. So, why did spawner decks become infamous? Well, there are a couple reasons, but we'll go over a few. One, pure defense turns into overwhelming offense. At first, spawner decks seem passive, but once you stack multiple buildings, it becomes a never-ending wave of troops marching toward your tower. Two, forces chip damage over time. Even if you play perfect defense, the spawn units will always get some damage in, making it feel like you're slowly losing no matter what you do. 3, counters slow win conditions. Decks like Golem, Lava Hound, or P.E.K.K.A. struggle against spawner decks because the constant waves of troops block big pushes before they even start. And finally, they are infuriating at double and triple Elixir. If you thought 1 furnace was bad, imagine 3 furnaces, 2 goblin huts, and a barbarian hut stacking troops until you can't even see the arena floor. I can feel my frames dropping already. I'm not here to debate whether these decks take skill because, let's be real, they don't. And honestly, they don't even perform well most of the time. There is a reason Furnace, Goblin Hut, and Barbarian Hunt constantly rank at the bottom of tier lists. Plus, how often do you even run into a deck like this? They're uncommon, they're bad. Yet somehow losing to one is easily one of the most frustrating experiences in the game. Almost as frustrating as seeing you're not subscribed to this channel. Seriously, what are you doing? Go subscribe right now, and you might as well hit that like button down there while you're at it. But if there is one deck archetype that can make any Clash Royale player lose their mind, it is Elixir Golem healer decks. These decks are the definition of spam. Throwing down an Elixir Golem, battle healer, and a mix of support cards until your tower gets completely overwhelmed. The worst part, even if you defend perfectly, it still feels like you're losing. So when did this nonsense begin? Well, Elixir Golem was introduced in November of 2019, and right away players knew it was something else. Unlike every other tank in the game, this weird blob actually gives Elixir to the opponent when it dies, making it seem like a high-risk, high-reward card. But that risk became non-existent once people figured out the real way to play it. Pair it with a battle healer and endless support troops. Battle healer, which was released 2 months later in January of 2020, was the missing piece that turned Elixir Golem from a niche card into a full-blown nightmare. Since the battle healer could keep everything alive for seemingly forever, the Elixir Golem's main weakness, that being dying and giving the opponent Elixir, didn't even matter. By the time you finally cleaned up the push, your tower was already gone and the Elixir refund was just a consolation prize. You did it. Good job, gold star. But why exactly is it so infuriating? Well, let me lay it out for you. It's pure spam. The deck doesn't rely on skillful plays or smart Elixir management. It just dumps everything on the back and hopes for the best. You also just get your Elixir too late. Sure, you're technically getting more Elixir than your opponent, but it only happens after the damage is done. Your tower's gone, so what's the point? The first push is everything. E-Golem decks don't care about defense, they just build up one unstoppable push. If you fail to stop it, well, that's it. And finally, winning against these decks doesn't even feel good. Beating an E-Golem deck doesn't give you that sense of satisfaction. It's not like you outplayed your opponent, you just survived their nonsense. Luckily, over time, Supercell nerfed both Elixir Golem and Battle Healer, making them less oppressive. However, the deck still pops up in mid-ladder and casual play, where players just want to drop everything at the bridge and watch their opponents suffer. Even today, it remains one of the most annoying ways to lose because nothing feels worse than defending perfectly, getting free Elixir, and still watching your tower disappear anyway. Elixir Golem is a deck that should never have worked in theory, yet somehow in practice it became one of the most rage-inducing strategies Clash Royale has ever seen. But that was the E-Golem. Now, let's talk about the E-Giant. A big bald guy who just strolls down the lane and zaps everything in his path. No tricks, no fancy mechanics, just an electrifying force of destruction that punishes anyone who dares stand in its way. So when did this shocking menace arrive? Electro Giant shocked the arena in October of 2020, and from the moment he was released, he immediately became one of the most polarizing cards in the game. While other tanks need support troops to thrive, Electro Giant does it all himself. Just plop him down and watch him stroll toward the tower, and unless your opponent has the perfect counter, your tower is about to become a pile of ash. He punishes you for defending, so while other tanks need support to deal damage, the Electro Giant's zap punishes any attempt at defending with swarms or small troops. He fries anything that gets in his way, no questions asked. As another point, overleveling is disgusting. At mid-ladder, Electro Giant becomes a literal tower killer. His ability to tank damage while dishing out massive zaps makes it nearly impossible to stop him, unless you're playing at a much higher level. And finally, he's just brain-dead easy to use. Just drop him, maybe toss in a lightning spell, and bam. You got yourself a win condition. No need for complex strategies, he's a one-card wrecking ball. Yes, dropping a lightning spell can help clear out buildings the Electro Giant struggles with, but that's a pricey 6 elixir investment, so what about a tornado? You can use it to pull all defending troops into his zap range, an Inferno Dragon becomes useless, a Musketeer barely gets a shot off before she's gone, and minions will be wiped out after landing just a single hit. One of the most devastating combos when facing an Electro Giant deck is Tornado plus Electro Giant. If your opponent times the Tornado right, it pulls your defending troops straight into the Electro Giant's radius, zapping them into oblivion. Whether it's minions, goblins, or other swarm units, this combo can destroy your entire defense in the blink of an eye. It's one of those moments where you just kind of have to accept defeat and move on. Electro Giant was overpowered a few months after launch, with his massive damage and ability to tank everything being borderline unfair. Luckily though, after a series of nerfs, he became a bit more manageable. He went from 8 elixir to 7, which sounds terrible as he's now cheaper to play, but both his damage and hit points were reduced by 15%. Despite these changes, he can still be extremely frustrating to face, especially when you don't have a building in your deck. But let's talk about a deck that definitely doesn't have that issue. Expo decks. Facing an Expo deck feels like a game of attrition. First, you're defending just enough to prevent any serious damage. Every time your opponent drops the Expo, you're scrambling to find the right counter, barely managing to stop it from locking onto your tower. It's a grind, but you keep holding on. But as the match goes on, it starts to feel like your defenses are slipping. With each Expo push, you find yourself spending more and more elixir to keep it from locking on. You're having to toss out more spells, deploy more troops, and use all your resources just to delay the inevitable. The cycle repeats, and each defense feels like it's costing you a little more than the last. You manage to hold the Expo off once, twice, even thrice. But then, your elixir pool, well, it's nearly empty. You've been defending so hard that now when the Expo drops, there's not enough left to stop it. You throw out your last troop, but it is too late. The Expo locks on. The elixir drought catches up to you and suddenly your tower is getting melted at full speed. And you can only watch as it crumbles. That is the brutal reality of the Expo. Defending until you're completely drained and then getting caught with 0 elixir, leaving you unable to stop that final blow. Now, an Expo alone can still be manageable, especially if you've got the right tools. Something like a Giant or Bowler can help tank the Expo's hits while dealing enough damage to take it down. You can confidently send in your tank, let it absorb the shots, and then watch as the Expo gets shredded. But here's where things start to get tricky. What makes the Expo even more devastating is when it's paired with Tesla. Tesla becomes the perfect tool to stop those very units you use to counter the Expo. Try sending in a Giant or Bowler, the Tesla is there to distract them, making sure they can't even reach the Expo. With its quick attack speed, the Tesla makes it nearly impossible to get those units close enough to take down the Expo, effectively shutting down any hope to break through. The Tesla's high damage per second is exactly what it needs to stop your tanks in their tracks. The Expo is completely safe from taking damage and can help you take out said Bowler or Giant. It's the perfect companion for the Expo. While your main goal is to get rid of the Expo as soon as possible, the Tesla will pop right up to ensure that that doesn't happen. Combined with a Knight and Ice Spirit, there's just no way you are breaking through. And let's not forget about the Tesla having an evolution on top of that. But let's say you do, by some miracle, break through. At this point, you've managed to defend every Expo push, but that's where the Expo player starts to shift gears. Now, they play defensive, moving their Expo and Tesla further back on their side of the arena. The idea is simple: keep their defenses safe while making sure you can't deal damage. Now, you're forced to attack because, well, while they're not attacking anymore, rockets or fireballs from your opponent start landing on your towers. And there's no way to stop those spells, but attacking becomes its own nightmare. While both the Tesla and Expo are purely defending, you're up against two buildings that will shut down any offense you throw at them. Every time you push, the Tesla will distract your tanks, and the Expo is targeting your troops from miles away. Your push has no chance of doing anything. It used to be even worse with this strategy. See, back in the day, players could force a draw simply by playing defensively. They didn't even need to chuck rockets at your tower or deal direct damage. As long as they knew they couldn't win, they'd just focus on fully defending with their Expo and Tesla. This left you stuck, unable to get through, while the game slowly dragged on to a frustrating stalemate. It's a lot better now, but that kind of tactical defense used to be a nightmare in itself. When you think of a card that can put constant pressure on the battlefield, Royal Recruits are one of the first to come to mind. These versatile troops create a unique challenge for any player, forcing you to deal with the constant flood of units while also maintaining control of both lanes. One of the most frustrating things about Royal Recruits is their ability to split push effectively, creating pressure on both lanes simultaneously. Their wide area coverage forces you to defend in two places at once, which can be difficult, especially if you don't have splash damage troops or spells to handle them. Without a good counter, you're left scrambling to stop them in both lanes, spreading your defense thin and leaving your tower vulnerable. Since Royal Recruits came with shields, spells like Fireball or Lightning lose a lot of value. The shields mean that even if you hit multiple recruits with a spell, a good portion of them will still remain standing. This makes it a lot harder to clear the group, especially when you're relying on spells for crowd control. The situation only gets worse when the Royal Recruits are paired with a flying machine. If your opponent has baited out your Fireball with Royal Hogs or other spells, the flying machine can just dish out constant chip damage while the recruits block your troops and distract you. The same tactic can be used in reverse though, with the flying machine baiting out your Fireball and leaving you with fewer ways to stop the Royal Hogs. This combo is incredibly hard to stop, as you need to deal with the flying machine from the air and the Royal Recruits on the ground, creating a two-front defense that is difficult to manage. With the Royal Recruits evolution, they've become even more dangerous. Usually it's a good thing to get rid of their shields, but now it results in them gaining a charge attack, which, my god, it just feels like the recruits are constantly being upgraded to stay relevant, making the deck even more annoying than it already was. The LumberLoon combo is one of the most frustrating pushes you can face, mainly because it's so hard to stop when you don't have the right counters in hand. The Lumberjack is a dangerous mini-tank capable of clearing out swarm troops or defensive units with ease. His decent hit points and rapid attack speed make him perfect for taking out smaller troops that would typically try to deal with the balloon. Once the Lumberjack is eliminated, he drops his Rage spell, which boosts the balloon's damage output significantly, allowing it to ramp up the pressure and deal huge damage to your tower. What makes this deck so frustrating is how fast-paced and straightforward it is. Without a building or a rocket in hand, stopping the LumberLoon push becomes incredibly difficult. The balloon can quickly lock onto your tower, and with the rage effect from the lumberjack, the balloon's bombs will drop at a quick rate, meaning it won't take long before your tower is shredded. Now, things get even worse when LumberLoon is used as the first move by your opponent. If they drop it as their opening play, you're likely caught completely off guard. Without knowing your hand, you may not have the proper cards to deal with the combo. You might be stuck with cycle cards, cheap counters, or single target units that can't handle the balloon or lumberjack effectively. Since you don't have a building or rocket ready, the balloon is free to do its damage, and by the time you try to react, it's already too late. It is the perfect surprise attack, and if you had a building or rocket, you could have easily shut down the push. But in this case, you're left with no way to defend, and it feels like you're just playing catch-up from here on out. Now, let's say you are dealing with the LumberLoon quite well, but then, just when you think you've managed to hold your ground, the freeze spell comes into play. When timed right, the freeze completely locks up your defensive units, giving the balloon a chance to continue dealing damage even if it's on low health. And if you have something like minions or archers, they'll die from the rage plus freeze damage, leaving the balloon free to finish the job. This combination is an absolute nightmare, making it almost impossible to defend once the freeze is used. The worst part about LumberLoon is that it puts you in a constant state of pressure. If you don't have the right cards in your hand, it feels like you're always playing on the back foot, with your opponent having all of the control. It's one of those decks that, when used properly, takes advantage of the surprise factor, making it feel like there's nothing you can do but sit and watch as your tower gets destroyed. And don't even get me started on the evolved lumberjack they added last month. At its core, Logbait is a deck built around the concept of forcing your opponent to waste their log on smaller, less impactful cards, only to follow it up with a Goblin Barrel that deals devastating damage to their tower. The deck relies on baiting out spells like Log, Fireball, Barbarian Barrel, or Zap while overwhelming the enemy with Goblin Barrel, Princess, and Goblin Gang. Every card in the deck serves a dual purpose: distract, bait, or chip away at the tower. The key to its success is the ability to apply constant pressure without giving the opponent much time to recover. There's obviously the Goblin Barrel, which can be thrown right on top of your Princess Tower for some instant pressure. They'll deal some serious damage, and if a knight is tanking for them, you can say goodbye to your tower if you don't respond quickly. Then there's the Princess. When positioned at the bridge, she is a huge threat. The Princess can constantly chip away at your tower, and unless you address her immediately, her damage can quickly add up. But that's not even the worst part. It's Princess's ability to draw out your log, hence the name of the deck, Logbait. In the heat of the moment, the Princess can lure your log away from its intended target. If you're already defending a Goblin Barrel, you might throw out your log to deal with the Princess, thinking you've solved the issue, but then your opponent's Goblin Barrel comes into play, and you've already spent your log. This can create a situation where your log is just too late, or even entirely wasted, leaving you wide open for the next barrel to land perfectly. What makes this even worse is the relentless pressure. While you're focused on defending princesses and managing the Goblin Barrel, your opponent is cycling Goblin Barrels from different angles, placing them just far enough apart that it's almost impossible to defend against them all efficiently. If you try to hold back your log to deal with the next Goblin Barrel, you might find yourself on the defensive again, playing catch-up and only able to clear part of the attack. Another frustrating aspect of this deck is the trickiness of the Goblin Barrel placement. It's not just about sending it to your opponent's tower. It's about baiting them into misusing their log. A skilled Logbait player will place the Goblin Barrel in a spot where you have to be extra careful with your log. The barrel can land a bit further behind your tower than usual, which can mess up your log timing. This forces you into a tough situation, where even if you try to time your log correctly, it still misses, and the Goblin Barrel hits. This trick positioning is one of the key reasons Logbait can be so difficult to deal with. It's a constant mind game, and one wrong move can leave you taking massive chip damage from a single Goblin Barrel. With log bait, it's not just about dealing with goblin barrels and princesses though. It's about managing your spells and timing, and if you're playing against a skilled opponent, you might even have to predict some moves. If your opponent forces you to waste your log or zap, they'll have free reign over the battlefield to constantly pressure your towers. The more you waste spells on princess or other bait cards, the more likely you are to miss the next barrel when it really matters. And vice versa. It's a constant cycle of baiting and pressuring, and before you know it, you're on the back foot, trying to defend more than you can handle. And when you're on the offense, they can usually shut down your push quite easily. Whether they're using a knight, goblin gang, or inferno tower, they'll have an answer for your push. I mean, this deck has been around for so long for a reason. Ultimately, the frustration of log bait comes from its ability to wear you down with every cycle. The trickiness of the goblin barrel placement forces you to be constantly on alert, and the princess can make you second guess your moves. You're always one bad play away from taking significant damage. And when it works, the sense of satisfaction for the log bait player is hard to match. Now let's talk about the most irritating, frustrating, and absolutely obnoxious deck in the game. Any deck containing Firecracker. It doesn't matter what deck she is in. If there's a Firecracker on the enemy team, you're in for a miserable time. This card somehow manages to be both the most annoying and the most unreliable in the entire game. On one hand, she gets insane value for just 3 Elixir. She lines up shot after shot, hitting your entire push while staying just out of range, like some kind of budget musketeer with infinite splash damage. You think you can fireball her? Well, think again. The moment she attacks, she yeets herself just far enough that your fireball whiffs completely, making you waste 4 Elixir while she keeps blasting away. And if she's paired with a tornado, boy, you are done. Your entire push is about to get lined up for her like a bowling alley. But let's talk about her evolved form, because somehow Supercell looked at this absolute menace and said, yeah, let's make her stronger. If you thought she was a nightmare before, she is straight up erasing your entire push while giving you PTSD. She'll delete your support troops, soften up your tanks, and still manage to push herself out of danger. Like she's got a built-in escape plan. And the worst part, when you use her, she shoots at the wrong targets, walks straight into poison, and somehow misses an entire minion horde. One match, she's a sniper elite for your opponent. The next, she's got the aim of a stormtrooper when she's on your side. Sorry, a bit of a tangent there. I know it's not a deck type, just a singular troop, but god damn, I hate that card. Deep breaths. All right, let's talk about the Royal Giant deck and why it is so frustrating to deal with. The Royal Giant itself is already a pain with its high hit points, targeting buildings exclusively, and long range. It's a unique tank that's not just lumbering at your tower, it's firing from a distance while soaking up damage. This gives it an edge over other tanks, like the Golem or regular Giant, which need to be close range to do damage. The Royal Giant can chip away at your tower from afar, making it hard to counter effectively, especially if you don't have a building to distract it. And the words chip away are used loosely here, as he deals a solid 446 damage at level 15. Without something like a cannon or tornado, the Royal Giant is nearly guaranteed to damage your tower, simply because you can't shred through its high health fast enough before it starts putting dents in your defense. But here's where the synergy with the rest of the deck makes it even more oppressive. Enter the Fisherman. This card pulls your defensive troops like the Mini P.E.K.K.A. or Prince away from the Royal Giant, completely throwing off your defense. It doesn't matter if you had the perfect counter for the Royal Giant. If your tank killers are now being dragged out of position, your defense just crumbles. The Hunter then comes in and finishes the job, taking down whatever the Fisherman just reeled in. Hunter's high damage output means even high health troops like Mini P.E.K.K.A. and Prince don't stand a chance at stopping the Royal Giant's advance. The Hunter also clears out swarm units like skeletons or minions with ease. This 1-2 punch where the Fisherman pulls away your key defense and the Hunter finishes off anything in its way creates an almost unstoppable force for Royal Giant to just waltz right to your tower. The evolved Royal Giant only makes this worse, as he can take care of something like skeletons or goblins himself with his recoil damage. Luckily, the evolution has been nerfed since its release, but it still remains very strong. Something else that remains incredibly strong are 1 Elixir cards. But why? What makes these 1 Elixir cards so good? Well, click this video right here to find out. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. I'll see you there.